Hi everybody. Without further ado, really, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker this evening, Raúl Sánchez Cedillo, who will be beginning to speak with us and chat with us speculatively about notions and ideas of constituencies. This is part of an ongoing project instigated by Moderna Galleria and part of the European-wide The Uses of Art, the Legacies of 1848 and 1989 project, which sees the museum and gallery members of l'Internazionale really begin to try and think through different networked confederate ways of working together and doing things otherwise, as Charles Escher would say. One of the key terms that l'Internazionale have begun to think through is the term constituencies, and I was having a quick discussion with Zdenka before about the fact that none of us really know what constituencies are. But it seems a very important and difficult but necessary and urgent debate to have. On one extreme, as we've all discussed, we run the risk of beginning to try and think of audiences or publics as constituencies and maybe do little more than rebrand the already familiar and ready to hand. At the other extreme, there's the opportunity for all kinds of institutions, not only museums and galleries, but universities, to rethink themselves from the ground upwards as constituencies amongst others. And that seems to be the much more tempting but much more difficult alternative. And over the next 2 days, as part of the Glossary of Common Knowledge, we'll be trying to put more flesh on the bones of those discussions and then heading towards at least a year, 18 months of research leading to a publication around constituencies, which again won't try to define or finalise anything, but will hopefully at least enable us to have a toolkit to begin a much more rigorous debate on a much more expanded and international level. So again, to begin that step and journey that we've already undertaken, but we wish now to begin in earnest, which is no small task, I'm going to hand you over to Raúl, and please put your hands together for what I'm sure will be a great and informative and very useful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you, Jan. Thank you, Zdenka and Bojana, for the invitation, and to the John Moores University too. As you may have read my abstract, and I'm going to try to dwell a bit on this issue of constituencies, which in fact I was thinking right about what you said, that in English is not a very interesting term, constituencies, because it deals with a territorial division of voters, or either that or the clientele, the interest groups around. But of course it comes from Latin. And I think that we should shift to Latin in order to explore it. But it's interesting because not only you, but for instance, Antonio Negri has begun to use this term in Italian, coming directly from Latin, as constituenza, which points to something rather different than that plain working of the political market. Instead, it is more about the active vectors of constituent power, and I'm going to rely on that relationship in my talk. So this relationship to constituent power is key if we want to, in my opinion, to address strongly this issue. And what is constituent power, by the way? Because it's, as you know, it's equally entangled and disputed term. It belongs to a long-standing juridical tradition, of course, that has its origin in the period between the English revolutions and, of course, Sieyès suggests pouvoir constituant de la nation. That is, it belongs to the radical democratic revolutionary tradition, but at the same time it belongs to the foundations of the, so to say, rule of law and democratic constitutionalism. That is, so to say, the bourgeois capitalist democracy, in opposition, of course, to any notion of popular or radical or anti-capitalist democracy. So that is the issue, and of course we have to make a reference to the work of Antonio Negri and his book, The Constituent Power, which was translated as insurgencies or something like that in English. I don't know why, but in both in Italian, Spanish, and French, as far as I know, it is constituent power. And it is a very difficult book, not only because of the profound and really extensive analysis of the occurrences of emergencies and transformations of the notion, but also because its main issue is to produce or to create a concept of constituent power adequate to its radicality, so to say, to its belonging to a notion of radical democracy and to its relationship with a much hated concept and reality of almost all political theorists, which is the notion of the multitude. That is the notion of a political subject that can't enter into any constitutional political order, that has to be tamed, that could turn into a hydra, that is a monster. I'm quoting Hegel, for instance, and other philosophers that really didn't like this multitude. And as you know, Baruch Spinoza, all his political treatises, both theological, political, and political treatises, rely on this notion. In opposition to Hobbes, to the reactionary theorists of the stabilization or recuperation of the English Revolution, in the favor of the gentry, or even the aristocracy. And Spinoza is the only reference we have if we want to really dwell on this radical notion of constituent power and at the same time on this political possibility of the multitude. And that's where this title of The Rest is Missing comes up. Why? Because of a strange coincidence. I would say that also Antonio Negri uses in one of his best shorter texts on the notion of democracy in Spinoza, which is reliqua desiderantur, so to say the rest is missing. And that's what we can read at the end of the unfinished political treatise, where Spinoza dies, apparently, suddenly, or we don't know, maybe he didn't know how to go on. And why? You have read this wonderful short book. This is open to conjecture, to an hypothesis. Why? Because he just begins this chapter, the last one, and he really starts to limit the notion of the multitude as in Latin omnino absolutum imperium, that is a state considered as absolute, a democratic state considered as absolute. That is, that the fact that the multitude commands absolutely. It is not mediated, it is not represented by another class of people, by patricians or experts or priests or whatever. It commands by and for himself when it is led as if it was a soul mind, a mind alone, like a common mind, we could say, no? Una veluti mentis duquitor in Latin, something like that. So this multitude that in democracy, for Spinoza is the, so to say that, or should be the whole social body self-governing itself, it starts just at the beginning of childhood to be limited. How? As you can read in the chapter, by excluding the foreigners. He says the pilgrims. He's talking about pilgrims that belong to another country and another sovereign, so they don't have the right to vote. But most of all, and this is, where, sorry for the expression, but where Spinoza really fucks up at the end of his life, most of all, he excludes women because no historical experience proves that they are able to participate in government. And even the Amazons, they don't seem to really have managed to have any imperium, any democratic state at all. And they are really unable to participate in government. And at that very moment, pop, reliqua desiderantur. So I think this is quite an extraordinary coincidence to address this issue of the constituent power of the multitude and its constituencies as these actors or vectors that in the current period are recreating, renovating this constituent power. Yeah, this fact that we still don't know actually what this constituent power could be. Why? Because in all its historical emergencies or transformations, it really never managed to stand as something different from the command of the one over the many, like Hobbes wanted, or the command of one class over another, or the command of a bureaucratic police state over the mass of workers, from the English Revolution to the Soviet Revolution to anything, similar to that. The multitude has failed to express something different from, a total perfection of the state machine, a total generalization of political obedience, and so on. But I think that in our late period of total global turmoil, since the Iraq War, I would say, like an end of the political process of what we said was the empire, as something that would, as a system of government of the global market that would go beyond a traditional system of states and on the conflict of imperialism and so on. This talk of global governance, etc., that ended with the Iraq War, and then we had the financial crisis. So this turmoil has had some emergencies of something that I think we must think of as a constituent power that maybe, because it's in the making, may give some spirit or some new meanings or even a more accomplished realization of this constituent power as the very name of democracy, as an absolute procedure, as the capacity to innovate productively and creatively the social field by the participation of everybody, by and for everybody. no? Which means something like a transformation or even perishment of the state as we know it. And of course also a transformation not necessarily violent or abrupt of constitutional democracy, of the check and balances as we know them. And these emergencies have to do with the 2011 cycle of struggles, the so-called Occupy cycle. I would say that we could call it the May 15 cycle because actually, you know, what has been the fortunes of the so-called Arab revolutions, or even the insurrections in Turkey, or the small emergencies in Portugal, and so on. But I think I can, honestly say that in Spain there's still some hope ahead, and that a huge political change is underway, and in a sense, in the spirit of the multitude, like quoting Kant, no? Immanuel Kant, when he said that the revolution, the event of revolution was something that, in spite of its failure, was something that has already changed people's minds, that has embedded a new horizon of political possibility for humankind. And I think that in 2011 we have witnessed something like that has a practical reality still in the south, I would say, in the south of Europe, and most of all in Spain. As you know, the movement in Spain was about real democracy, and there's something like an enigma about what this reality would mean, because the whole European Union is considered to be an example of democracy, or used to be considered an example of democracy, and particularly Spain an example of political transition, and so on. But as a result of the combination of this total surrender of the Zapatero government about social change and his promises, and the reality, the harsh reality of the Euro crisis, spontaneously came this word by the people organized in May 15, this word, this expression of real democracy, that has put democracy again on the political field as something that we still don't know what it is, as a new concept, as a neologism, so to say. So this constitutional democracy would be an unreal democracy, something that has usurpated, that has stolen the name of democracy. And I think that this is something that we have to dwell on in order to go deeper into these characteristics of feature of constituencies of the new constituent power. But before, I think that we have to dwell a little bit with these problems of the notion of constituent power, because as Negri says in the book, in the end, constituent power has been neutralized by three traditions of thought, not all of them reactionary, also progressive. That tradition would be the Jewish-Christian tradition of creativity, like we are made in the image of God, so we are able to express, beauty and good and so on. And so there is this hidden foundation of any democratic expression that is everlasting, that is always there, that we only have to express. So the actual historical, so to say, finite, contingent subjects are but manifestations of this eternal creativity. So they are sort of relative. So constituent power is never absolute. It's always it's a derivation, it's a derivative. The other would be, and is very related, the just naturalistic conception of the social field separated from the political field. That is, constituent power would be just a manifestation of something that was underlying in the social field, in the social relationship. So let's say, because now it's hype, particularly in Spain, this cultural hegemony of a subject or something like that. And the other one is the constituent power as a never reach transcendental foundation. It would be like a sort of Kantian practical idea of reason, in the sense that it expresses a sort of, this would be also Rousseau, no? The general will is always the best expression of the will of everybody, but it is not reductible to the singularities of the parts that compose it. It is never fully perfect. It is like an ideal of reason. So the actual historical constituent power is always something relative. It's always something that has to be structured by an external agent, be it representation, be it the state, be it a moderation force. At the same time, even in a revolutionary democratic context, we have three problems about constituent power that have manifested through the history of the political expressions, on historical expressions and conceptual expressions of the concept. These are sort of apories of the concept. The first one is that what is power? In English, we also, same as with constituency, we have this problem with power that we don't have in Latin, in the Romanic languages, this distinction between potentia and potestas. Constitute, we can make this difference like saying constituted power and constituent power. But at the same time, power is always there. So the problem is that when it manifested itself as a constituent power, even being extra juridical at the beginning, it turns into something creating law, creating norms, creating regulations. And this organization of power has always turned into a one. So the problem we have is that we aren't able to practice, not only conceive power as something that involves a multiplicity that keeps always been a multiplicity, that is never reduced to one. Even Spinoza says ambiguously that the multitude is democratic when it leads itself as being one mind, even. This problem is that when the multitude opposes power, it turns into one. It has this tendency. The second problem, and it is related, would be what is otherness to constituted power. So, if we don't think in dialectical terms, in a if we don't rely on metaphors about top and down or social and political, because they can't, they are incoherent with the concept of constituent power, which is about the reunion of the political and the social. What is the antagonist force? What is the other opposing constituent power? Which means, how does this other evolve or transform itself into power? Different power, but constituent power. And this is the problem of the revolution and reformism relationship, and that has never been solved and has a lot to do with this problem of constituent power. We don't know what defines the otherness of constituent power, because in the tradition, the more powerful it gets, the more similar to former power it becomes. And the third is how do we impose constituent power? How can it win? Because the tradition is, as you know, the notion of revolution is about terror, in the sense of both Kant and all the German reactionaries said about the French Revolution. And in the Soviet Revolution, this idea of an avant-garde, of a separated political avant-garde, necessary to accomplish this rupture, this break-in, this definite coup against the constituted power, has been the solution. Because what was the other option? The other option was the second a priori, the idea of an otherness that somehow insinuates evolving into, or in the through the holes that exist in the constituent power. And that would be the hypothesis of sine die reformism. But we don't know how does, in the second a priori, we don't know how this difference or this otherness is able to impose itself. This a priori is the a priori of cynicism, the a priori of, so to say, Machiavellism. Or we can say, if we want to refer to current examples, we could say that this is the a priori of the populism, as we have known it in Latin America, and it's the problem of Podemos in Spain. This idea that I'm quoting Pablo Iglesias. He says that first you seize power, and then you apply your program. But first you have to seize power. And to seize power, well, you have to do whatever in terms of acting on the imaginary of the people, of these fragmented people. It's more Laclau, of course, than Pablo Iglesias. But simplifying is about this idea that the people, as something opposed to the multitude, that with Spinoza is a subject that is able to self-govern itself. The people is always ignorant, is always fragmented. It needs an external operator that, through this chain of equivalences creates a one that is embodied in the significant, or in Lacanian terms we would say the small a object of the leader. And that would be the way to for the people to have a progressive, favorable government. But we are always into this cynic idea, because of course those doing that operation are beyond that ignorance state. They are the avant-garde, they are the educated, they are the elite. So this is the rest that is missing, that we don't know how the multitude can overcome this aporis. We don't know how political change can create a radically new, creative, beyond any comparison, beyond any measure, political order that is able to sustain itself and that is created by a subject that has created itself throughout the process, the multitude. The multitude is always new, at the same time is always there, but as a political construction, it creates itself through the commonalities or through the constituencies it creates in its struggles. In this sense, for the multitude, the struggle is always a creation. It is always a metamorphosis. It is always an excedence or an excess of being. There is always something more there after the struggle that there was before. So the idea for the multitude and constituent power of this so common notion of accumulation of forces is different. It's always accumulation of power in the sense of potentia, no? As the capacity to express an innovation in being intended as a production of subjectivity, of new modes of living, feeling, affecting the others and being affected by the others, of an interdependence and modification of the subjects in the process of creating the multitude. Nonetheless, I think that, as I was saying, that the 2011 cycle has presented very interesting features of that allow us to think of the possible renewal and also an actuality of this idea of constituent power. That's something that can really recuperate or renovate or or liberate democracy from its current discredit, because that is what we are living now in Europe and throughout the world. So to say, the people doesn't believe anymore in democracy, intended as constitutional democracy, and that explains the situation in the rest of Europe. Always more countries in Europe. Take, for example, France or Germany. It is a really tragic situation that we are living now in Europe, and it has to do with the discredit of the democracy and the idea of democratic revolution. The left is absolutely responsible for that, but that we could maybe discuss it in later. But I think that we can already enumerate some, let's term that, constituencies. Constituencies as these vectors of innovation, or matrices of innovation of this practice and notion of constituent power. The first one would be, and of course it is not present in the historical examples and theorization of constituent power, would be the post-colonial matrix. That is, the fact that, let's limit ourselves to Europe, the fact that contemporary metropolis reflect or express the reality, the accumulation of colonial exploitation, but at the same time of colonial or post-colonial struggles and innovations of the metropolis and so on. In this sense, the idea of people, sovereign people, the idea of democratic sovereign subject, which is unified by this common belonging, doesn't stand anymore. And this is one of the keys to the crisis in France, for instance. They are all sovereignist, both the far right and the left, but they do have like several millions French citizens that come from the colonies. And at the same time, some good millions of people that are resident, not French nationals, that come from throughout the world. And these people are excluded from the political system. So this post-colonial dimension is something that absolutely breaks down the idea of unified people. It doesn't and won't exist anymore. So any project that relies on sovereignty, in my opinion, is always suspect of this kind of exclusion, and is a project of hegemony of the upper classes over the lower classes, the subalterns. I think that in spite of its failure, the so-called Arab revolutions are something that immediately establish a relationship between the South and the North, because the South is in the North, is in the metropolis, and it is there to stay. And any democratic issue has to rely on that and has to catch up with this historical irreversibility. The second one would be what me and others have termed in Spain, because of the extensive and intensive use of the social networks and so on, during May 15, the Indignados movement, etc., and still we have, would be the technopolitical matrix. The technopolitical matrix is about doing politics through the interfaces and interaction of something that is not the usual political subject, the rational decision, the rational decision, liberal rational decision subject, but it's not, nor it is the collective trade unionist or party-like conscious kind of agency, but it's rather the interface of, let's say, bodies, brains, and computers through the intermission through the mediation of algorithms. This is something that, of course, happened first through the so-called Arab Facebook revolutions and so on. We also had this small and suddenly vanishing Portuguese thing. You remember in February 2011, this Geração Arrasca, which was something organized by a few bunch of people in a few weeks, that made 200,000 people taking to the street in Lisbon and really surprising everybody. And then in May, in Spain, we had the same. Something that was organized through the networks as a political protest, nothing very original with regards to the, a decade long of so-called flash mobs and all these things that, of course, have to do with this swarming technique of cooperation between separated individuals and so on, that has to do with this interface between computers, brains, etc. But I think that the threshold that was created by the May 15 movement through these technopolitical practices was the fact that it really managed to create what we have termed a network system, an open network system that has characteristics of emergence. That means in the theory of complexity, as you know, emergence is the emergence of new properties that weren't there in the components of this system. that are unexpected of, that somehow emerge and unexpected. And at the same time, this network system has been able to be autopoietic, which means that it innovates. It creates new properties, stable new properties that somehow interact with the previous component, that somehow transform the underlying structure in the sense, in political terms, that effectuate or create a profound transformation of subjectivity of the people, in the sense that it changes minds, profoundly, in the sense that it creates a deep and standing revolutionary aspiration, which wasn't absolutely in the agenda before, as you know, and it is now. But the difference of this network system is that involves something that it wasn't clear in these theories about flash mobs and so on by Reingold, Howard Reingold, the Australian theorist, as you know, intelligent mobs and all these things. The difference is that here it involves affects, as you know, that are so important for Spinoza. The theory of the transformation of bodies and minds is made only through affects, and affects are the same as ideas, are the same are two faces of the same reality. The body, or as Spinoza says, the finite mode, which in materialist terms is a body, body and mind. And this involvement of affects, that emotions, and these inventions of new affects is this qualitative difference that the technopolitical practices of May 15 have introduced, that have opened up a new political realm, because what is this about? It is about separated, isolated, even disabled people using a computer to affect and being affected by a whole bunch of others through social networks, through all the possibilities, through these multi-level networks, mobile phones, computer systems, mail, WhatsApp, whatever. Creating this network system of with a huge intensity of effects that was able to last in the Spanish case, because it was led by one main effect, which was indignation, indignation, or I don't know how we could say in English, outrage, I don't know. But indignatio, let's go back to Latin. Indignatio, Spinoza says that it is that the hate we experiment when we see somebody doing harm to some other that we think of as an equal to us. It involves equality. It involves a hatred against those who oppress or those who do harm to our equals. And that was the main effect, and it was invented, so to say, it was vehiculated, transformed through this technopolitical thing. Of course, the left wasn't there, the NGOs wasn't there, the traditional media wasn't there. They tried to deny, they tried to say this is just Facebook bullshit, etc. But the main thing is that this network system is not only about the internet. It is something like it involves the earth. Why? Because through this technopolitical circuitry, for instance, in the Puerta del Sol in Madrid, you had the people being there, not just staying at home, like tweeting or whatever, and they were also tweeting there. So you are both physically there facing the police, and at the same time affecting the others, like streaming what you are doing. And this huge, dense concentration and circulation of affects create this magmatic, very profound transformation of subjectivity, which is hypothetically, we could say, what can explain the May 15 movement. I think this is something that is here to come, that is very difficultly recuperated, because once you have this real thing of indignation, for instance, once you have a real production of affects, and as we know, struggles always produce affects, all struggles, ever. Strikes, workers' strike, the dockers' strike here in London, in Liverpool, that were known in the whole world. But at that time, there were huge problems of communication, even among trade unions, cooperation, at all. This is something new, and even a single small struggle can be able to enact a huge solidarity and a real struggle cooperation throughout the world. And this involves a transformation of bodies and brains through this affective thing vehiculated through algorithmicism. This is something that I think is a real constituency. The other one, which is pretty involved with this thing, the other matrix, would be that is related to the transformations of production and reproduction, and I have called it the symbiopolitical matrix, which means or symbiopolitical or anthropogenic matrix. And to put it more in a more simpler way, it has to do with the fact that contemporary societies rely on a huge amount of unpaid and recognized labor. And most of it is care labor. It's about caring, it's about loving, it's about an affective labor. It's about, of course, it is a whole industry of health services, educational services, and so on, which are the main force of productivity today, as we know. And this is one of the keys to the current capitalist crisis, that they don't want to pay this, and at the same time they want profit. And the way to deal with this is this financialization and the hegemony of rent instead of profit, you know. And this thing is completely new, because it adds a new feature of the multitude that, as we have seen, wasn't there in Spinoza. Because, of course, this involves a lot the so-called feminization of labor, but not only. It is symbiopolitical it is something different to this biopolitical thing, because it stresses strongly on this, that you need more than yourself to live and to be reproduced in this society, that it is always a multiplicity, and that is always this relationality and this recognition of the other that makes things work, and that makes things productive of new social being. We can't imagine a constituent power without this revolution of care, and without the recognition as an institution of this reproductive and at the same time productive care work. This is something that economists Christian Marazzi have called the anthropogenetic or anthropogenic mode of production. That is the fact that currently the main force of production, and we could also say it of surplus value or surplus use value, so to say, is this thing, is education, is health, is art, is culture, and so on. And this is something that, as we know, is the most affected by cuts and by neoliberal austerity and so on. And if we don't overturn this picture, no change is possible. And at the same time, if we overturn this picture, a new subjectivity, political subjectivity, is going to emerge. I could say that this is something very clear in Latin America, the way the people are able to resist and even seize power or be a constituent power through this involvement of communities and care relationships and services, so to say, self-managed services, even unofficial and so on. This whole multitude of informal labor and informal work, unpaid and precarized, that really sustains society. And last, the last main matrix that involves, of course, the first one, the post-colonial one, is the post-national matrix. And I think that this is something very, very pertinent or to the contemporary or to nowadays Britain with this referendum on the European Union, because this transformation of the whole world system and these effects of the post-colonial struggles, these phenomena that we are witnessing today, the fact that, want it or not, several millions of people coming from Syria and the Middle East are going to have to live in Europe for long because their countries are going to be totally destroyed, as we can see, but totally, and maybe they could become uninhabitable. How do we deal with this if we don't accept any Nazi, fascist, or any kind of hypothesis, more or less moderate, like we are witnessing that are taking the lead today? I think that assuming that democracy can't be linked to nation state anymore, and if you say nation state, you say homogeneous population anymore. And I would say even that if you talk to democracy, you have to talk of a heterogeneous, multilingual, etc., society. This is something that applies also to the United States, which is, experiencing huge problem with this Latino emergence that somehow tends to break at least the homogeneous language, official language of politics, of businesses, and so on, which is the English. And we still haven't seen, or maybe there are, but I can't remember now, a political society, democratic society that is based on this assumption, not multicultural, but the fact that there is a multitude, not of people. And if you are talking of people, you are talking of peoples in plural, which means that you don't have any traditional popular sovereignty anymore. So I think that these are elements that enable us to define what we could think as a putting into practice of these constituencies in the definition of what in Spain has become a sort of a hype, that is a constituent process. We want to change. It seems that always more a majority wants to change the political systems in the same, about transparency, about representation. There must be something more than political representation by the parties, about social justice, about accountability, about participation, but also about the integration of the whole citizenship in the political process. But as we have just said, a nation state, or a failed nation state like Spain, because it seems that there are more nations than one, and since the Catholic kings, they don't really get convinced about that finally. They still want to have one traditional nation state, but it doesn't work. It is not going to work. It has to be at least European. So, at the same time that we are having this constituent process, I would say that it is, in fact, a European constituent process, beginning in Spain, maybe failing, but at the same time a constituent process. So, just to finish, what could be the main features of this political constituent process? I think that for first, it would be that it doesn't belong to anyone, or else it belongs to the multitude. Since it is an extra juridical force, it can't be never abolished or suspended by any political actor, of course, nor the king, nor the Supreme Court, or whatever. It is a disruptive force, and it has to be the way May 15 has been. Of course, keeping in mind that we shouldn't think, because it won't work, of an avant-garde Bolshevik party or whatever. But at the same time, it has to be disrupted. It has to disobey radically. Otherwise, it won't be any constituent power. At the same time, this constituent process shouldn't be state-centric. This means that we have the possibility of defining a way of, reconstructing, of recreating society that doesn't put the state or some sort of a state-like entity at the center of. Of course, we don't know how to abolish the state, but reasonably we can think of like putting the state a bit off about dealing with social processes or class struggle or everything. This idea of the state as a central, unique, sovereign actor in society, which with the welfare state transformations that define current social democracy or democracy, constitutional democracy with social content, or even the so-called European social model, that puts the state as managing the common reproduction of the population, has to be cut off. They are already cutting it off with austerity. So we should take the opportunity to rebuild it as something different as the welfare state, and there has been proposals to name it common fare. That means the self-managing of the common production and reproduction of society by common political entities created by the multitude that are not state-like in terms of an absolute command, of an undiscussed command, of an absolute sovereignty about what is legal or illegal, and so on. This is also a critique of the constitutional check and balances, rule of law thing. We know the way things are discussed in social networks. We have proven that this network system can is able to decide, that the multitude is able to decide through the mediation of this computing recursive process, the way you, through different waves of inputs, you have different, more convergent outputs about a political decision, like, for instance, ending the acampada at Puerta del Sol. It was very long and boring, but in the end, through this complex discussion process that involved the people there, the networks, and so on, this recursivity of decision, this technopolitical thing, allows the multitude to decide as if it was one, considering of the possibilities. I think this is not only this, but this is one main thing that we can rely on in order to have a non-state-centric constituent power. We have seen these problems in the late Latin American process, the thing in Venezuela. So statocentric that they haven't been able to transform the mode of production and to pass from a oil-based rentist economy to something different, to a common anthropogenic based on education and health industries and so on, kind of society. Because the state only wants to reproduce itself. It's like that. And if you are into a class struggle process, you know, everything tends to the one, to the state over the multitude. So this is something absolutely fundamental. There have been proposals about this non-state-centric thing, like, for instance, in a more evolutionary approach, like Michel Bauwens, the theorist of the commons, who talks about or has written about this idea of a partnered state. You know, like a state that is like a partner there, not a very sympathetic one, but it's there, like managing things still difficult to deal with, like security, some things about security, maybe frontiers, etc., etc. But the assumption it is that is under the spell or under the command of the multitude, of the counterpower. What is opposing this diminished state, which is an inversion of the minimal state of the neoliberals, by the way, but for the better? It is, the other of this is a network of counterpowers. It's not any abstract identity. We shouldn't say Soviets because it is misleading. But it's something like that. It is political entities of the very citizens themselves that are able to network, to institutionalize, to be accountable, to be sort of legal, but in a conventional way, in the sense that law, in this sense, is always a convention, is always a pact, a covenant. It hasn't these characteristics of transcendence of the law production. And this is something we do, of course, in struggle. For all of you that have participated, there are some kind of laws, but they are contingent, discussable, renewal, etc. And nobody is over the top to say, this is the law. It is about discussion, it's about dialogue, it is about the relationship of forces. And so what about obedience? Because how can this work without obedience? It's the same. Spinoza says, deals with this issue and says that obedience is something that is automatic when the society is led by the guide of reason. The guide of reason is, for Spinoza, the best thing for the common, the best thing for the multitude. So we have sort of an idea, of a kind of idea of what this obedience would be. The obedience is, of course, not absolute. So there is the right to disobey. And this right to disobey can be regulated. So any constitution of the, or any constituent power of this new multitude has to paradoxically constitutionalize disobedience, because, but of course, under some conditions. And those conditions are, or should be, always evolving. Disobedience has to be defined by the common notion, and this is common knowledge, of what is intolerable in society. And what is intolerable in society, as we know, has never been the same. But what is intolerable for society today? I don't know, like child labor, like rape, like anything like that, like patriarchal oppression, like maybe wage labor, and so on. And that's intolerable, and the right to disobey is guaranteed with certain conditions. But this is something that goes beyond any historical experience of constituent power that has always imposed obedience as a command. I remember particularly those awful, but not morally, but awful lines of Lenin and Trotsky about firing those in the period of the war, the Civil War, those refusing forced labor in the, or discussing production quotas and so on, something like that. I mean, the possibility for any constituent power to enter into a war with those belonging to the privileged constituent power is always there and must be avoided. So another feature of this constituent process is that it must involve another, it has to avoid any Leninist or Schmittian notion of the friend and foe relationship as something definitive. I mean, it has to regulate the limit to antagonism. It has to regulate the possibility of the antagonism to distract the common that is being created, or distract democracy. And how do you do that? Of course, it is a problem of common decency, like Orwell said, and it is a problem of common notions, of the transformation of the multitude through the struggle. It is an ethical problem, but not ethical in the sense of, something, that you take into account after the event, but ethical in the sense of a real guide of the behavior of the people as something fundamental that is embedded, or that is embodied in the workings of the constituent power, which means that there are no enemies in society. So nobody can be excluded from right, from the law, and there can be any war in terms of, sovereign war, Westphalian war, which regulates the relationship between the states. But as we know, with the Iraq war and so on, there is this thing called penal law of the enemy, which applies to, the Guantanamo people and several citizens at any point can be considered an enemy of society and be destroyed. And that's what revolutions have always made as well. And last, and I'm finishing really, this constituent process has to be preceded, because it involves the political realm. And of course, we are in Spain, we now have new political parties like Podemos, like Guanyem, like Barcelona en Comú in Barcelona with Ada Colau and so on, which to a faraway spectator, it could seem like, well, this going back to normal. No, this is now a change of elites and so on. I don't think so. Why? Because on the contrary to, the classical relationship between struggles and political outputs, in Spain, the struggle is always there. So to say, the multitude is always active and vigilant, and in a sense, it's constituted itself politically. So in order to have this constituent process, something must happen, of course, in society. And how can we call this? We call this an event. An event in the sense of, in German, an Ereignis, un acontecimiento in Spanish. And May 15 was such an event, a total turmoil in society, a total qualitative transformation of what was right and wrong, and what was due to do and not, etc. So this is the constituent process of society before any modification of the political order. So this is a condition. I mean, for Europe to have this constituent process, something must happen before, of course. Social struggles, turmoils, etc. But I do think that we still have to count on these political turmoils happening in unexpected places. Maybe Britain, maybe France, which seems totally dominated by this xenophobic, reactionary thing. It is a condition, otherwise it will only be a spectacle, and it will be made from above, like Europe was made, the European Union, and now we are paying the price of that technocratic, bureaucratic construction process. No? But this is the horizon, and that's what I'm inviting you to think during these 2 days, this maybe, hopefully, European constituent process. Thank you very much.
We've got a wee bit of time left, so I was wondering if anybody's got any questions. But thank you for an absolutely great talk.
The audience, I think, because I'm not sure that I will hear you well. Sorry.
I can speak now.
Okay.
We're lacking a mic, so if we want to allow a question, and if you find any time, we'll just like to repeat it.
Right.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the talk. I think it's important that you presented all these debates as they are, as open, as not solely and problematic, and I think that that's very useful to not take these concepts as solutions, but as problematic ways of looking at the process we have at hand. And I think that that's super important, and I thank you for this kind of approach. But we come from, I think that there's a tension among us, I don't know if you agree, but as you said, the English uses of this term of constituency are less interesting. But I have the feeling that in this group, there's a little bit of those understandings of the terms when I just arrived to the group. I had the feeling that when we talk about constituency, it's just a way of talking of all these things differently, and that of course makes a change. So that's not something to not value. I think that's valuable, but in a way, I think that we go back a little bit to this understanding of constituency as group of interest. So I think that we have something to discuss here, because if we open it up to this other way of approaching the term, I think that we have a problem as institutions, museums. How the hell do we deal with this understanding of constituency as museums, as institutions, that in a way, after this process of international languages, that have to end up destroyed and disappearing. So institutions need to keep themselves existing, and I think that that's a difficulty regarding the challenge that constituency puts us.
Right.
So how do you think that we can deal with it? We are that won't be bombed, destroyed, taken by the masses, or because they defend themselves very well.
Should we have more questions or just like one by one? I don't know.
It's entirely up to you.
Okay.
I think we can
Go.
respond to that in a way.
Go.
I'm kind of, I guess, new to the group, but I work for this institution. I also work for a major museum. And in our institution, the way we conceptualize constituencies are as kind of constant groupings of individuals that transform and also challenge us as an institution in what we program and what we present to a wide range of audiences. So it's kind of a terminology that I use quite freely in the curatorial work that I undertake, but it's also one that I have some slight discomfort with because it has this kind of wider meaning in the English language. So I would just say in response to that, I think having a kind of approach to learning and unlearning what constitutes a constituency is a way of thinking about how we might approach this through institutional means. But also within the constituencies that I work with and we work with, they also have their own kind of sub-constituencies that then report back to us as an institution. So it's a constant process of negotiation and, as we say, unlearning and relearning what this might mean. But I think in what you're talking about through Negri and Lazzarato or other kinds of people is this idea of multitude. And I wondered how you position the kind of, let's say, neoliberal understanding of a constituency with their understanding of multitude, because I see it differently. I'd like to say.
Yeah.
I think if I understand you correctly, your formulation of the idea of the multitude depends on the supposition that you are dealing with the human. But what about the subhuman? How does it figure into this?
The subhuman.
Is the subhuman. Probably a very good example of what constitutes the subhuman is the person who is not even an other, but does not register at all. It's something somewhere halfway in between. Well, a slave will be a good example.
Right. Okay. Well, first, because I'm more used with about this dealing with cultural institutions than with these other difficult questions. Mostly your last one. Well, I think that in my experience with cultural institutions, progressive ones, there has always been an ambiguity, in Spain at least, because practically they were created through the financial bubble, with the involvement of banks and so on the basis of an implicit agreement that was that you're going to have a public, prestigious, smart city-like, branding city-like face, like the Magba or now Reina Sofia. And at the same time, you are allowed to work with minorities like subalterns, but also political minorities and so on. I think that Spain has been as far as I know, the most intensive and educating example of that, for the good and for the bad. But at the same time, there was this implicit agreement that those minorities will always be minorities, that it was all about tactical collaboration, that those minorities couldn't, no way, like stop and think, well, we are working with this museum, why don't we transform it? Why don't we say it is undemocratic to have these, councils of bankers and politicians deciding how much money is going to this and that, etc., and also using it for their prestige and beneficial action on society and so on. That was a financial bubble compromise, so to say. At least in Spain, that phase is over. So this idea of constituencies is at the same time also a new approach, because these, not only the operators, the agents, which is absolutely a key question, how are they going to survive in this situation, not turning into, I don't know, whatever job inside the creative industries or the lumpen creative industries. But rather, how can really turn into instituent actors, which is the key point here. Because in the case of Spain, it is still to be seen how the cultural progressive institutions that were at the very edge of the avant-garde, as far as social movements were concerned, because Tonina knows that the MACBA was key to the constitution of the anti-global movement in Barcelona at the end of the 90s, but really not just. And yeah, it was such was the conjuncture that you could do that without being destroyed, because it made part of this ambivalence of art and politics and everything, and of course it was all about minorities, that there was this huge, stable middle class trusting in the system and in credit and everything. And it was like a compromise with the precarious creative people that needed funding, that needed a certain mask or legitimacy to do their disobedience, that enter into this compromise. But now this is all, that's over. So it is, the problem now is that the very institutions themselves, they are part of the political change, and at the same time they define a new cultural model which has to do with the commons, absolutely, to define the cultural production, the museum, the archive as a commons, which has to involve the transformation of the management of the institution, or else they will be prisoners of their own compromises, and they will be prey to these financial guys that we don't know what they're going to do. And this is something that somehow in the May 15 has been discussed, or lately in the municipalist movement in Spain, about the definition of a cultural model after the creative industry, not before, because creative industries have failed because they were linked to this intensive, in Spain, intensive exploitation of precarious creative networks, strategies of city branding and valorization of real estate rent in the city, and a total spectacularization of the creation of social bonds, of social links. It is like a sort of conversion into an artistic of cultural commodity of the very workings of, think about, hip hop labs or hack labs or things like that were created by the people in the squatter social centers, as far as I know, in Spain, etc. So this is something that is not the usual question, what can we do for you? Of the cultural institution is now, what are we going to do for ourselves with the others? No? And And this involves changing this late notion that has to do with some Lazzarato thing, that this idea of creation, création de public, the creation of the public, in this ambiguity of the public opinion, the citizens, but also the consumers. And this poses for this idea that first you create a subject in the sense of a subject that desires something, like something that is advertised, this idea that before selling the car you have to create the desire to have it as it is, applied to the cultural production. So you create your public through this stimulation. But of course this involves a market structure, an open market structure, a competitive structure, and this kind of strategies that didn't really work in the Spanish case, as far as I think, because they were really heavily subsidized and publicly subsidized, and also privately subsidized, and weren't really into competition. But I think that that model doesn't work neither, because there is such a huge amount of poverty, and the underlying subject that was supposed to become a public was the middle class. And that strategic middle class project has ended in Southern Europe, at least. There is no middle class anymore. We are all becoming poor, precarious, and so on. So we don't really want to be lured into becoming public. We want, or people, I think, that's tending to demand more education, more access to the cultural institutions, and so on. And this is something that is instituent and constituent, as far as I see. About the subhuman, well, the subhumans are the first subject to be taken into account in order to think about this constituent power. What are the subhumans? I don't know. In Spain today, because there is slavery in Spain. Of course, they don't call it like that, but all the agribusiness sector, for instance, in Almeria and so on, well, those are temporary slaves, or you could say indentured servants, no? People that is fixed, they can't move, they don't have an identity, they could be anyone, etc. And they are destroyed by labor, by work, sorry. And this is the subject that is excluded from all versions of known until today of constituent power. But these people are able to enter into the political realm through many means. By one, through the struggle. We had a huge insurrection 15 years ago in Spain, in El Ejido. There was a rebellion against these agribusiness bosses that were exploiting and at the same time creating an apartheid outside of the city. They couldn't enter into the city, and they had to rely there in these fields of intensive, green grocery production. But at the same time, they can enter through the technopolitical way of participation that is key to the May 15 movement. But also they can act through that means, because they also, let's think about this certain species of slavery, which is domestic work, which is made by immigrants, mostly women in Spain, undocumented for the most part. And we do this care work so fundamental to the stability of the middle classes and to the very model of the middle class, actually. And I think that precisely because the rest is missing, we have to set out from what you have termed the subhuman. But think also of the people, disabled people, the disabled people that can only interact properly or effectively through a computer or through computerized systems. I don't know, for instance, we have a city councilor in Madrid which is a disabled hacker that is now doing this. He's in charge of the participation, network participation programs in Madrid, and he's totally disabled, like very heavily disabled, as you know, so to say, normal people. And I think that's key, absolutely. And that's the key. The definition of subaltern is that the people excluded from the, from the orderly eugenetics of political, political normality, no? Be it male, white, middle class, educated, and so on. The late democratic insurgencies I have talked about are about this. They involve these subjects, but at the same time they involve all the others. And on the basis of a certain asymmetry, because we can't be utopistic, we must think that power relationships are always there. The problem is that they are productive and not anti-productive in the Foucauldian sense. But there is this possibility of even disabled people or even a non-Spanish speaking or non-English speaking person can, through computers, through algorithms, participate in the process and even be recognized, of course. That's, of course, the challenge. No, it's not a factual, consolidated reality.
Are there any?
Just a point. I really enjoyed that. It's the best 15 minutes I've spent in a long time. Just hearing your ideas and just the ways in which you articulate them too. It gave me a lot to think about. And it's just an observation, really. Like you mentioned May 15th and what's going on in Spain. In Ireland, we have a kind of analogous movement as well that's developed around the issue of water charges. And just what you said there throughout really spoke to me about how that's developed. The anti-water charges campaign, the Irish government, they destroyed the economy with the property bubble and the so-called boom and everything, the Celtic Tiger, as it was known. Many of us, myself included, had to leave the country. Many of us, our careers, homes, lives were economically shattered. And it seemed as if the Irish people were being very compliant. They were actually, the Greeks were carrying at their protests banners saying that we're not like the Irish. They actually had it was a great source of shame to me personally. But through this constituency idea or discourse that you're talking about here, that you're offering, there actually was very subtly the development of opposition and a radical alternative as well. And it was just interesting because at the same time the mainstream press, the Irish Times newspaper back in 2013 called for Irish people to be individually vetted by the police, right? Before they should get access to the internet. That was an editorial piece in the Irish Times newspaper. And since then, a government minister, Taoiseach, she's like the deputy prime minister, she complained that as well, that she actually described water protesters as terrorists. And so she called them dissident Republicans, which equates with terrorists. And you have all of this crazy discourse at work on the side of, I suppose, of conservative power. But what you discussed today really, in many ways, spoke to me about what's happening to in Ireland, and I'm sure that in other places. And I think that there's great hope because the Irish people were, sort of ashamed to say it, but they were very compliant. And all of that changed, I think, because of what you're describing. They learned these practices and theories and applications, and they learned it on their own feet as well, and very, very suddenly, and especially young people. So thank you for what you said. I thought it was brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, but about this water thing is absolutely key because, as you know, it was a fundamental feature in Bolivia, no? The struggles for gas and water that created that constituency that led to this constituent power and this constituent assembly and everything. Well, it's an unfinished process. It's in a huge crisis now. In Italy, they had this referenda on water and gas. So this commons issue is absolutely key, the natural commons, so to say, because the other would be the network commons, the intellectual commons that are key to the destruction of democracy. And democracy and commons, of course, are absolutely linked today. So without an institution of the common, or several institutions of the commons, that is to say, how do we manage this thing, there is no democracy anymore. I mean, there is no public, strong Keynesian for this model anymore because it's not going to work. Why? Because it lacks its constituency. It lacks the fact that either we take in our hands the management of those commons, or they will be prey. Even the most, good-hearted managers would be prey to the financial powers, which is what is happening with, these less cerebral policies about keeping the welfare state that is always, always less and less and less, until there is no resistance because the people, as you said, is compliant. So. Yeah, fundamental. On the other hand, we are all, as you know, as the economist said, we are all pigs, no?
Can I just ask a question of terminology? Because you said, and I think it could be useful for us to do this before we start our 2 days. Could you just explain to us what the Spanish terms are and how they differ from the English and how you use them and how they're used before you come into this? Because I have a feeling that it's an experimental use of the word constituencies.
Yeah.
And for me it was also very important to listen to you today because I understood that you put something else into the word than one would normally do in English. Because the whole problem, the whole misunderstanding of constituencies, I think arises from how it's normally used in English, as you also said, but how do you use it in Spanish?
Yeah, well, I think the fault is Zdenka and Jones and Boyana in the sense that I just follow the thread of using it, but as I said, also Negri started to think constituenza, no? In Spain, there is a whole, traditional body of thought about poder constituyente, even in the most reactionary theorists that inspired Carl Schmitt, like Donoso Cortés. They use this opposition to poder constituyente, no? This opposition to the French Revolution, in fact, no? Coming from the reactionaries, the absolutist reactionaries. And in this sense, it is a common use. The problem would be, at least in Spain, the meaning of it. The use it is, but the actual innovation is under discussion because, of course, this is under discussion. This is the main thing now, because in Spain, everybody knows that the current constitution can't stand anymore for several reasons: corruption, unfair representation, the obsolescence or distrust of political parties, traditional party system, and so on. So there has to be, and also because of the Catalan issue, etc., there has to be a constituent process. But by that, they understand what happened in 76, 78, I mean, the parties gathering and writing at a cafe or something, 8, 10 representatives writing a new constitution and then doing a referendum. And that would be a constituent process. What is under discussion, thanks to, and dispute also, thanks to the May 15 movement, is precisely this idea of a constituent process that involves the multitude, that involves processes coming from below, that, as you were saying, that the fact that the subhuman enter in the stage, no? Are at the center of the stage of the political process, the plebeians, so to say. And this is the main thing about how this thing is going to be solved, because, of course, there is clearly a traditional dimension of it. I mean, today there is the discussion about the possible majority in parliament. There won't be any majority, there will be new elections. That's my hypothesis. But after the new elections, there will be another correlation of proportion in parliament, and one time or another, this issue is going to be, has to be decided. It involves, for instance, what happened in Bolivia, no? The creation of constituent institutes or assemblies, local, etc., discussing the constitution and then electing a constitutional assembly. It involves something that deals with the emergence of the intervention of the multitude, those unexpected. And I think that this is the key now. It's about not just the terminological innovation, but about the meaning of it. But I think that this, how can we translate constituency in Spanish? It would be as something new, it would be constituencia, like in Italian, and it's absolutely unheard of. So, like in Italian, and it's something new that we are doing right now. But I think it is quite interesting because it deals with this detotalization of the idea of constituent powers as something that deals with these matrices, these issues, with these emergent subjects that add something to the composition of a new constituent power. It's not something formal, general, that you already know how it works, no?